my reason for thinking that it's important for us to think about it is because these are questions people in the world struggle with. And I think sometimes there are things that we struggle with too as Christians, not being able to know what's going to happen, or things happening unexpectedly and not as we would expect them to happen based on what we know about God and His promises and His faithfulness and His goodness and all those kinds of things. I think they're things that we struggle with. And so thinking about this idea that there are lots of things in life that we can't control and that we can't know what's going to happen and all of that, why would God create the world that way? What benefit does it have for us to not be able to know those things ahead of time? Why would it not be better? And I've had Christians who have asked me this before. Well, wouldn't it be better if we knew ahead of time how things were going to turn out, and then we could make decisions accordingly? Why is that? Why would that not be a more beneficial way for things to work?
Well, you probably wouldn't grow very fast if you could make a situation better than what it actually is. That could be one reason, maybe.
Okay, that's potentially a possibility, and I want to go further with that, because I think that ultimately leads to perhaps a greater problem in my mind. And, obviously I've wrestled with this question, and like I said, I think a lot of us have, whether or not we acknowledge it or not. And I know people in the world do. They look at things and they think, well, based on what you say about God, this doesn't make any sense. And so they are inclined to dismiss God or be less willing to investigate about God because of that. And so that's the reason why I want us to think about this question a little bit this morning. Not because we can really know the answer, but because, at least for me and maybe for others of you, it helps to wrestle with these kinds of questions and at least come to some kind of balance in my mind that is reasonable or makes sense to me. Not that everything has to make sense, because there are lots of things that don't. Why would it be a problem if we could get to a solution faster, or we could resolve things? That sounds like a good thing to me.
Lack of reliance on God, maybe.
Okay, I think that's the deeper root of the problem, is that if we could foreknow all that was going to transpire and therefore make better choices, better decisions on the basis of those things, which that's kind of another side question, and I'll come back to my point, hopefully, if I don't forget it. Would we always make better choices or decisions?
No.
We wouldn't. We like to think that we would.
But we would think that we were in control.
And I think that's a big key. Go ahead, Greg. You had something. That's the point I was going to make, Margaret.
So I think the premise here needs further examination. We have been told how things turn out. We have been told who wins in the end. We have been told a lot of things about our future, about our destiny, about judgment, about God's sense of justice and mercy. And we can operate within that framework and make decisions knowing how things will work out in the end. So for someone to make that argument, I would come back and say, I've got a lot more foreknowledge than you do. If you're going to say God doesn't have the ability to control my day-to-day environment, he's not interested in that. He's interested in establishing a framework in which I can make choices knowing that he is still in control of the big things.
Right. Well, and I mean, that is a good point. I mean, we do have the end. We know how things turn out, and that's part of the point of Revelation, is that you don't have to get anything else out of the book of Revelation than the fact that who wins in the end? God and Christ and the Holy Spirit win in the end. So whose side do you want to be on? Well, I mean, we all want to be on the winning side, right? I mean, at least that's what we would say. So if we want to be on the winning side, we want to be with God. We want to align ourselves with God, because He's going to be the victor. No matter what transpires between now and then, whether it's the end of your life or the end of the world, God's going to win this battle that's raging right now That it seems at times that God's not winning, that Satan's the one who has the upper hand. God's going to win. So we want to be on God's side, and Greg's right. From that perspective, we have more knowledge and understanding of the big picture of things than people in the world who don't have God and don't know God. So that is something to cling to, and it's something to bring up. But I think the other point, and this goes hand in hand with what Samantha said, is what Margaret said, and I appreciate her making the point. I wasn't saying I was going to make that point to say, thanks for jumping ahead of me. I'm glad she made that point. But that is that we would think about it more from the perspective of that we're the ones who are doing this. And if you look in Scripture, it's really clear. It is a resounding theme from the beginning to the end that God has put things in the order that He has so that we will learn to trust in Him and not trust in ourselves. I think about Deuteronomy 8, and that's why I say from beginning to end. Deuteronomy 8, God says, I led you the direction that I led you to going to Canaan. It wasn't the fastest route. It wasn't the easiest route. It was the route by which He could teach them the lessons that were necessary for them to learn, which is you need to learn that man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. You need to learn to trust me. And that is what this life is all about. And what we need to understand on the basis of the fact that we know God, whether we know anything else or not, we need to be really clear about the fact that God has arranged things in life in a way that encourages and builds us to trust in Him to its fullest, because that's ultimately what life's about here, and it's ultimately what gets us to life beyond this life, is trusting in God. And the more deeply we trust in God, the easier this life will be. I don't mean it'll be a bed of roses and there will be no obstacles along the way. That's not the point. In fact, we can look at some examples in Scripture of people who were extremely faithful, whose way was seemingly made much more difficult. I mean, you want to look at anybody, Jesus, of course, but Job and Joseph, others come to mind. Ruth had a pretty hard time. Esther didn't have it so easy, even as a queen. So we look at all these different people, and faithfulness in God does not necessarily mean a smooth road. It may mean a bumpier road, but what it does mean is it means that ultimately you will have the tools necessary to overcome that, both now and then ultimately to spend an eternity with God. And so spend eternity. Mary Walker would cringe at me saying, spend eternity. You can't spend something that has no end. And she's right. And, we can say it's semantics, and we try to use terms that explain, but you can't spend it. And she would also say we're already in eternity, and she's right about that too. I mean, eternity has what? We always say God is eternal because He has what? There's two things He doesn't have that makes Him eternal. He doesn't have a beginning. He doesn't have an end. So when did eternity start? It didn't. When does it end? It didn't. So we're in eternity now, but we're talking about our eternal state of being with God that we're looking forward to. And the way that we get there is by faithfully trusting in God. And so the more we can nurture and build that, the better our life will be now, and obviously when we leave this physical life that we're a part of now. So anyway, I mentioned that. Andrew brought it up in his prayer, and Ecclesiastes has continued to bring that theme around over and over and over again. And I do think it's a good thing for us to at least contemplate and think about a little bit. Someone after class on Wednesday night, we were talking a little bit about these various miscellaneous admonitions. They brought up verse 8. He who digs a pit will fall into it. A serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall, and so on and so forth. And we talked about the fact that when you read all of these, or a lot of these, they seem to have kind of a recurring idea, which is that we have to be careful the way that we do our work, because the one who's working can be injured by the work that they're doing. And I think that certainly is an application of at least some of these, if not a lot of them. But they brought up the point that when they read verse 8, they actually saw a little different spin on it. Often, the kind of pit that we're talking about here that you would fall into, what's the purpose of those pits? To trap someone. Could it also be said or be true that the one who digs a pit or builds a trap for someone else could end up falling into their own trap? Would that be a warning that might be offered in Ecclesiastes or elsewhere in Scripture? Sure, absolutely. And so, which one is it? And the answer might be yes. I don't know. But it's okay to take one or the other. We could take the one that was suggested to me after class in verse 8 and use, certainly when we get down to if the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, you must use more strength. So not only, as Andrew pointed out on Wednesday, not only is an axe that's not sharp, not as efficient at chopping the wood, it could also be dangerous and could injure you. So both of those ideas could be wrapped up in this set of verses, and both are certainly helpful to us as a warning, and encouraging us to do the right thing instead of, or the better thing, I guess, instead of going in the direction that these passages talk about. Jim, you had something.
Yeah, if you dig a pit for someone else, we see the evil usually works out its own rebuke.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, again, to apply biblical principle, he who sows does what? He reaps what he sows. So, and again, that's not as though it's immediate. So you may not fall into your own pit, but you may fall into another pit. Irony of ironies, you could dig a pit for somebody and then walk away from that pit and fall into another pit just shortly on your way out. Some people in the world call that karma. We call that biblical principles. You reap what you sow. He who dies by the sword, or he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, is another form of that same principle. But just a warning to be careful, because the things that you do, and I think again this has been stated in other places in other ways. Be careful what you say about people behind closed doors, because someone might hear it and carry it to them, but also other people say things about you. And so if you live that way, then you can expect to find some of the same kind of treatment in life.
I may be overthinking this,
Okay.
but what you're talking about kind of reminds me of what Jesus said about the measure you use, it will be measured back to you.
Yes, I mean, again, that's, I think, again, a restatement of the same principle. Of course, Jesus is, I think in that context, are you talking about Matthew 7, using it in the context of judgment? And the word in that passage is judge, is usually translated in English translations as judge not, which leads all kinds of people in the world to utilize that passage in ways that it was not intended. The real context bears out, and I think the original language that the word he's using is the idea of a condemnatory judgment. So it's not the idea of discernment so much as the idea of condemning someone because of their conduct. And Jesus is just saying, you be careful with the standard of measure that you use. You be careful with the way that you judge and the critical nature of it, because however you judge other people, that's how God's going to judge you. Yes, sir.
Well, I've spent the last 3 weeks chopping root balls and small trees and things. I've been using a max.
Yes.
And, so I read this with sore muscles right now. But I have been chopping and stop and think, is it time to sharpen my tool now?
Right.
Because I have to set aside what I'm doing. I have to make some preparation. I use a hand file, or a couple hand files. It's not a pleasant task to me
Right.
to do it. There's no good way to grasp a mattox while you're trying to sharpen it. You know that. You try to hold it between your knees. I don't have a tools tells me the work goes better too. But my point is, wisdom brings success. We almost act sometimes as though wisdom strikes us randomly or strikes some people and not others.
Right.
And wisdom is about preparation. When you think about the one who digs the pit, the one who's breaking through the wall, you've got to plan this stuff out.
Right.
You've got to think about it. You've got to weigh your options. You've got to decide what makes the most sense. You've got to stop what you're doing and do something else sometimes.
Right.
You've got to put away one tool and get out another because you're not using the right approach.
Right.
So wisdom is, in this context, a lot about preparation, forethought, planning, and then execution, evaluation, and then replanning.
Yeah, and you talk about using the right tool. That reminds me of Steve Barry from out in St. Peters, Missouri. He used to always say, he helped me with a lot of house projects. He always used to say, I'd say, well, we need to do this, and he'd say, well, they make a tool for that. And that, Steve said, the way I've gotten most of my tools is my wife's given me some task that she's wanted me to complete in the house, and he's like, you know, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to need this tool. And she's like, go get it. So he said that's how he gets his tools. And but yeah, his favorite phrase was that, you know, they make a tool for that. And he was right. There's almost always a tool for something that makes it easier than the way you would try to do it without it. A pickle fork's really handy for breaking a wheel off of an axle, as opposed to trying to do it some other way. And it is important to learn how to do things more effectively and safer and all of those things. I've been working for Reliable Comfort now for almost 3 years and doing duct cleanings and duct sealing for most of that, all of it. Mostly duct cleanings now, but I recently, in the last 2 months, learned a new trick that makes our work a little easier on certain applications. And it's like, I mean, just continually learning things that can help you do the job more efficiently and more easily are good. And that comes, that's wisdom. I mean, ultimately, it's a form of wisdom for us to do that, and we can do that in things like what Greg was talking about and what I'm talking about, and we can do it in life in general. Andrew.
Maybe to Dad's point about wisdom being about preparation, I think a key piece of that is the ability to picture something in the future, the ability to pre-visualize one's end goal. You know, grandmaster chess players are grandmasters because they can pre-visualize the game dozens of moves ahead, tens of moves ahead of where they are right now, and they can see the board how it's going to be later before it gets there, and they can make a plan. And I think about verse 14 and 13 and 14, where the fool's words win him favor, but the words of the wise words win favor, but the words of the fool are self-destructive. At the beginning of his words, they're foolish. At the end, his talk is wicked madness.
Right.
So what I picture with that verse is you start out with a half-baked idea, and there's something not quite right, there's something that's not quite provable in that idea, but you cling to it and you don't really have a plan going forward, so then you have to say something else to justify the half-truth and what you said before, and then you have to say something else that justifies the false claims that you made in that statement, and pretty soon you're trying to defend some really outlandish and completely unmerited ideas. And I've seen this a lot in interviews and commentaries that people make, where they start with one idea, and then by the end of the interview, they're trying to persuade you of something that's just bizarre and has no basis, but they have to, because they started with foolishness, they didn't have a plan, and now they're trying to justify complete madness.
Yeah.
So the degradation of not being able to see the end goal where you start, and you know, I start a lot of comments in class without the end goal in sight, and that's not a wise thing to do, because then you end up trying to crawl your way out of the hole that you dug.
Well, and I mean, you're right. I mean, I've read some books and commentaries where initially they make an argument that sounds reasonable on the surface. It may seem like a little bit of a stretch, but you look at some things and you think, well, I can see how that might be a way to apply that, or how that might be understood. And then you keep reading, and as Andrew said, an idea that started off half-baked, it just gets worse the more it gets baked. It's awful by the time it's done, and you're like, what in the world have they, how did they get here? Jim, and then Andrew, and then Margaret.
In addition to what our brother Walker said, I read here recently, one of the pioneer preachers said, the Bible sure sheds light on and explains them commentaries.
Yes. Andrew.
And the last thing I forgot is that maybe that can shed some light on all the times when the writer says, who can know the future? He says in verse 14, a fool keeps on babbling. He just keeps going. He's got no end in sight. Yet no one knows what will happen. Who can tell him what will happen in the future? And I wonder if there's almost an element of, if you are pursuing wisdom, you can't know the future, but you can at least look ahead a little further than the fool can. You
Right.
can at least try to see the end of the path that you're on a little better than if you didn't try that wisdom.
Yes. Well, and as your dad said earlier, ultimately we can see the end, even if we can't know what the path's really going to contain on the way. Wisdom at least allows us to see what God has promised for us at the end of the road. Yes, ma'am.
I want to go back a little bit to Andrew's
That's all right.
first statement about the fact that the chess player sees the end of the road. That goes all the way back to me to Aaron's lesson on ways to alleviate things you've learned the hard way. The first part of that, the first of the 3 points that he made was that when you start to take an action or do something, a way to alleviate a bad result is to try to see the end result, not the immediate result, but the end result. And I think those 3 points, I have shared those with so many people, and I think that those were such good lessons of ways to alleviate the fact that you're going to learn a lot of things the hard way.
God bless you with a good memory.
Because I didn't even remember that.
So I'm not even sure Aaron remembers that lesson. But yeah, great points, and
The second
appreciate
one was
you.
to not let your temper get in the way or your emotions.
Right.
And the third one was to surround yourself with people who challenge you to be the best possible you can be.
She got all 3 points from that lesson,
But that was a great lesson.
and she's been using them because she's been sharing them with other people. But yeah, thinking about the fool and the wise, there's multiple points that are made in this text, and he's made multiple other points about foolishness and wisdom. But obviously, of the two, which one's the better one?
Wisdom.
Wisdom's the better one, for a whole host of reasons. What other things do we see in these latter few verses, 16 through 20? Oh, look, there's verse 20. That's one of the things I mentioned earlier about saying things about people, specifically in this case about the king. But I think Andrew mentioned this on Wednesday night, but not only the idea of using the right tool and making sure the tool is ready for the task at hand, but then also just the concept of laziness, which is a continual theme throughout Proverbs. I don't know that we've seen it as much in this book, but the idea of what happens if you're lazy, at least in this context. And again, it's a principle. It's not intended to be an overarching example. But, think about it. He uses the example of somebody who obviously is a homeowner. If you're a homeowner and you don't ever do anything to maintain your house, what happens? It falls apart. And that starts out in some ways that you might be able to live with. I've got a deck that's not in great shape right now. It's not unsafe, it's just not very pretty. That's not especially a big deal. But if I do the same thing with the foundation of my house, what ultimately happens? I mean, the whole house can cave in. Can become unsafe for us. It's unsightly for the neighbors, and it can become a big issue. And again, it's a principle. It's not intended to be the overarching representation of the idea. It's just suggesting, I mean, what happens to a life that's not well maintained? Same thing, it falls apart, right? And initially it may be in some ways that you can handle. You get a little tired, maybe lose some weight or gain too much weight, but ultimately it can, I mean, fall apart completely. Everything, it can be disastrous. And so the importance of being, to use Andrew's point, thinking ahead about what the goal is, and the points that Margaret made from Aaron's lesson, thinking ahead to what the goal is and working toward that end, as opposed to just taking it easy and doing nothing, really important for us. Okay, anything else about chapter 10? I'm ready to move to chapter 11. Thanks for all the comments on those verses. I think some really good points made by each of you. Okay, chapter 11. I love the beginning of this for multiple reasons. Some of them I just think are really good kind of visual illustrations of the principle that he's trying to get across. Some of them kind of funny, I think. So let's look beginning in verse 1. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow. He who regards the clouds will not reap. Verse 3, if you didn't know, the last half of verse 3 is the part that I thought was funny. I mean, if a tree falls to the south or the north, wherever it falls, there it'll lie. Really? Is that how that works? I mean, that seems like an obvious point. But, so anyway, looking at this, cast your bread upon the waters. I read that, I can't help but think about when my brother and I were little kids. We lived in a subdivision called Streamland. Guess what? It had a creek that ran through it. It's really clever. And we used to play in that creek all the time. We'd catch snakes and crawdads and even catfish. Some the traditional way with a rod and reel. Some the untraditional way, at least at the time, with noodling, sticking our hand up underneath the bank and pulling out a big catfish. So anyway, we had a blast doing that. And there were times when the creek would swell and then it would flow pretty good, and we would go to a section of it and drop a stick and then get on our bikes and run as fast as we could to another section of the creek because we wanted to watch where it came down and watch it come out. And that was just all kinds of fun for us when we were kids. Now kids like to sit on their phone and watch games, but some of them like to play outside. But we were outside all summer long and played in that creek a lot of times. What's the idea, though, of casting your bread on the waters, for after many days you will find it? Is it really about throwing a stick in the creek and riding your bike as fast as you can down to another section and watching the stick come down there? No. Jim?
Yeah, the way we would say that, what goes around comes around.
Okay.
The chickens come home to roost.
Okay.
Galatians 6:7, be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man sows, that shall he reap, so forth.
Okay, so that is a potential way of looking at it. What's another possible way? Yes, ma'am.
Well, the Jewish culture was very concerned with generosity, and it's possible, like reading through the NET, it's possible that it's talking about, your generosity will come back to you. You'll be rewarded.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look in the context, I mean, the principle Jim's talking about is obviously, as we've talked about already this morning, very biblical. But if you look at the context of this passage, verse 2, give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on the earth. And this is the ESV. If the clouds are full of rain, they do what? Once they fill up, they empty themselves. Do you know when they're going to empty themselves? I mean, you can look out. We look out all the time around here in Columbus, don't we? I joke, I tell Ashley Moses is back. Some of you may not like that joke. But there'll be a line of thunderstorms and rain headed our way. Coming from the west, it's coming from Bloomington. It's going to hit Bloomington, and it's going to hit Nashville. It's going to hit all those areas. And it's coming straight for us, and all of a sudden it gets to Columbus, Indiana, and it goes, and it goes to the north and the south. And then it gets just past us, about to Hartsville, and it blows up again, and it's a full solid line. And I'm like, what in the world? I mean, how is it that we are this geographic anomaly that splits all these massive squall lines of thunderstorms? But we do it all the time. But so we look out to the west and we think, oh wow, here comes this big line of thunderstorms. Or if you're like me, you get on your AccuWeather map radar and look at it, massive line of thunderstorms. Ashley, you're going to get some storms. You're going to get to enjoy the thunder and lightning and the wind and all that stuff and the heavy downpours. And no, we don't get any of it. So we can't predict when that's going to happen, but we know that it's the principle, right? When the clouds are full of rain, eventually they will drop. And so all of those points are designed to remind us that while we may not know the end of a thing, and that's the point of verse 4, he who observes the wind will not sow. If you're too critical, have too critical an eye with regard to the weather, what will you do as a farmer? I mean, there comes a point in time when you've got to just do what? You got to get it in the ground. And there comes another point in time at which you got to get it out of the ground, or you got to harvest it. And so if we're too critical, have a too critical an eye with regard to the weather, we might not do either one of those things, and then it just is all for naught. There's nothing there. And so as Ashley said, the passage, verses 1 through 4, seems to be focused on the idea of our generosity. We may not know how things are going to turn out. We don't know what the world's going to be like. But what we're called on to do and to be as God's people are generous with the things that we have. And that can be true of physical things, but it can also be true of spiritual things. Can it not? Do you necessarily know when you start sowing the seed where it's going to fall on a good and honest heart and bring forth fruit? No, we don't. So what do? Jesus tells us in Matthew 13, and the parallel passages, the sower goes about doing what? Sowing seed. Where? Everywhere. He's just scattering seed everywhere because he, unlike the guy who could look, I mean, a farmer's not going to go out in the middle of a bed of rocks and throw corn seed. Not going to be very effective. But Jesus is talking about hearts. And we can't look at a heart and tell whether it's a stony heart or a thorny heart or a good heart. So we just cast seed everywhere. And so this is true both physically and spiritually, that we are to take the gifts that God has granted us and be generous with them, because we don't know which ones are going to produce the fruit that God is seeking. And to use Ashley's point, in the form of our physical generosity, and Paul even makes this point in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. He talks to the Corinthians about the importance of making good on the gift that they had promised to the needy saints in Judea. He uses the example of the Macedonians, who at the time were extremely poor and still gave of their means. He looks at the Achaeans and he says, you all are in a really good position right now, and you promised a gift, and you ought to make good on that promise, because we're not trying to take away from you so that you're going to be poor. It is a matter of taking your excess to provide for those who are in need, and who knows but what later somebody else's excess may provide for your need. And so that's kind of the point of verse 1. Cast your bread on the waters, for you will find it after many days. If you're a generous person, if you will utilize gifts that God has given you, and again, physically, spiritually, or otherwise, God has a way of making sure that those things come back to you in some form at a future time. And that's what I've talked about. It's one of the paradoxes or seeming paradoxes of Scripture is, if you want to be prosperous, you want to have a lot, what should you do with it? Give it away. And it doesn't mean give it all away. That's not the point. It just means be generous with it. And that's a principle throughout Proverbs, and it's found in a lot of other places too. And there are lots of those ideas. If you want to be great, what should you do? Be a servant. So over and over again, those are repeated ideas. They're counterintuitive because it doesn't sound like the right idea. It sounds like if I want to be prosperous, I should hold on to everything that I've got and be like the rich fool over in Luke and just store it up for myself so that when there is a famine, then what do I know? What do I have? I have my store. I can take care of all that. I can take care of the famine, the period where I'm in want or have need because I've stored all this stuff up for myself. God says that's not the way to do it. You want to be great? Well, I should just be great. No, God says be a servant. And so those are principles that are found again throughout Scripture from beginning to end. Andrew.
And we need to be careful with what form that return takes.
Yes.
Because there are those who abuse this idea that
Yes.
if you give to our movement, if you give to our organization, well, just be patient and you will make back more than what you gave. And if it hasn't happened yet, well, you just got to keep waiting. And that is quickly abused to exploit people.
It is.
And we need to remember that sometimes this is a shift in mindset where if I am able to give liberally with the attitude that I don't care what happens to this once it's given. I don't care if I ever get anything back in return. You will prosper if you have that mindset.
Right.
Because then you can believe, you can know I can be prosperous with less than I have even now. I don't need this that I'm giving to other people. So it's easier to prosper when you are not expecting a real percentage return on the kind of gift that you give and the generosity you give to other people.
Yeah, so I was going to follow up what you said with, does God promise us an 8% or 12% or a 15% return on our investment? And I'm not saying that those people that Andrew's talking about do, but the idea seems to be if you give to us liberally, it'll be returned to you threefold, fivefold, whatever it is. God doesn't promise that. And as Andrew said, the point is not to give because you're expecting to get it back. The point is to have the mindset where you give because you trust in God and the principles that He provides, and you recognize that this is a way in which He has planned to provide for those who are less fortunate. And you do all of those things for the right purposes and reasons and realize and trust that God has said He will always take care of you. Some of us have found ourselves in difficult times at different times in our lives. And these principles can be very helpful. It doesn't mean don't do anything because God's going to take care of it. But we can trust that we're not going to go hungry. God's going to make sure that we have what we need. He's going to take care of us. And so I think it's a psalm. I've never seen the righteous begging bread. Does he mean that literally? Because I'm pretty sure I've seen some examples of people in Scripture that were faithful that seemed like they were pretty, what we would consider to be destitute. It's a general idea. And the point is not so much that might not be the means that he's using to get his bread at the time, but God's going to provide. Ashley's been looking at a book that's dealing a lot with Jewish culture, and one of the points it's made is that in first century Palestine, the role of a beggar was actually a recognized job of someone who lived during that time. If you were a person who was unable to walk or work or do something in society that would allow you to make money, a beggar was an actual recognized role and job. And so that might be the means by which they were providing for themselves. Who's still providing? Who always provides? God does. And so, as Andrew said, it's just important. It's important for us to keep some balance in that and understand what's really being said and what's not being said. I'm not standing up here promoting the idea of the gospel of health and wealth, and I think most of you who know me know that's not the case. But God does say He will take care of His own who are willing to apply the principles that He reveals for us. Did you have something, Liz?
I
You
was
have the
gonna
last word.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that giving of yourself doesn't always have to be monetarily or even it's a mindset. It's giving yourself to others, not necessarily giving of items or material wealth or even physical things. It could just be emotionally giving yourself.
That is an investment, and that is a generous using of something God has blessed you with. And so she's right. Anything and everything could fall into this category, and it's important that in any aspect of this that we utilize those things and that we use them to the good of all, and especially those of the household of faith, to quote Galatians 6 and verse 10. Appreciate the interaction this morning. We'll start there. If there's anything else we want to add to this idea found in 1 through 4, we'll do that. And then we'll work our way through chapter 11. And if we get through with it, we'll start chapter 12 on Wednesday night. If we don't, we'll start chapter 12 on next Sunday. We'll